There's a pattern that destroyed Spain, broke Britain, and erased the Soviet Union from the map. A pattern so consistent, so brutally predictable, that every superpower in the last 500 years has followed it step for step right before collapsing. And right now, in 2025, the United States is deep inside the exact same sequence, not approaching it, not flirting with it, already moving through it. The same structural cracks, the same economic rot, the same illusions of invincibility. Different century, same math. Spain believed the gold would never stop flowing. Britain believed the empire would never stop expanding. The USSR believed the system would never stop holding. They were all wrong. And the warning signs that ended them are the same ones America is showing today. Military overstretch, runaway debt, currency distortion, collapsing productive capacity, social decay, and the early fracture of reserve currency confidence. You're not just watching history repeat. You're living inside the next iteration of it. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how this collapse pattern actually works. Not in theory, but through the real timelines of Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Then I'll show you exactly where the U.S. fits inside that sequence, the stage we are already in, and the stage that arrives next. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once a country enters stage 4 and stage 5, the end doesn't drift in slowly. It accelerates, fast, violently, without warning. The only question left is whether America has time to pull out, or whether the next chapter is already locked in. Let's begin. History doesn't collapse randomly. It collapses rhythmically. And if you look closely at the world's fallen superpowers, you'll see the same 5 mechanics, repeating with surgical precision. To understand where America is now, you have to understand how this pattern devoured every great power that came before it. And it begins with the empire that once drowned Europe in silver, Spain. In the late 1500s, Spain was untouchable, the richest empire on earth. Silver pouring in from the Americas, armies deployed on 4 continents, a currency trusted everywhere. But behind the glory was a fatal imbalance. At its peak prosperity, Spain believed infinite wealth made it immune to consequences. Then the mechanism began. First came the overextension, wars in the Mediterranean, wars in Italy, wars in the Netherlands, wars in the New World. Endless fronts, endless commitments, endless spending. Then the distortion, coins diluted with copper, silver supply collapsing, inflation erupting across the empire. The economy buckled. The crown borrowed heavily from Italian and German bankers, defaulting 4 separate times in 40 years. And because easy silver had replaced real production, Spain hollowed itself out from within. They stopped building, stopped manufacturing, stopped innovating. Imports surged, exports dried up, talent fled, social decay accelerated. And once the foreign silver mines slowed, the entire imperial structure collapsed under its own weight. The lesson of Spain is simple. When a superpower feeds on extraction instead of production, collapse is inevitable. The pattern is identical. 3 centuries later, the British Empire entered the same sequence. At the dawn of the 1900s, Britain ruled the largest empire in history. 400 million subjects, trade routes on every ocean, the pound sterling as the global reserve currency, peak prosperity, peak confidence, peak illusion. The first crack came with the cost of global dominance. Military commitments on 6 continents stretched the empire thin. 2 world wars shattered it. World War I drained the treasury. World War II finished the job. Britain borrowed billions from the United States, shipping out gold reserves to pay for weapons, fuel, food. By 1918, Britain wasn't the lender of the world anymore. It was the debtor. And then came the currency problem. The pound, overvalued and chained to an unrealistic gold parity, collapsed under the pressure. In 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard, and the pound fell 25% overnight. That single moment signaled the end of global monetary leadership. After that, the decline accelerated. Colonies broke away. Manufacturing lost competitiveness. Debt ballooned. And between 1947 and 1970, the empire evaporated. India gone, Africa gone, Middle East gone, territory after territory peeling off until nothing remained. Britain didn't fall in a battlefield defeat. It fell from economic exhaustion, a global superpower that could no longer afford its own weight. Again, the pattern is identical. Now fast forward to the Soviet Union, the most recent collapse and the fastest one. After World War II, The USSR emerged as a second great superpower. Nuclear weapons, global alliances, satellite nations, unmatched land army. But beneath the steel exterior was a dying engine. The Soviet Empire ran on military spending, not production. They poured 15-20% of GDP into the military, triple America's share, despite having a much weaker economy. They subsidized Cuba, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, Afghanistan, every ally they could to maintain the illusion of global influence. Military overreach burned through resources at an unsustainable pace. Then came stagnation. Soviet factories produced junk. Farms failed. Technology lagged decades behind. The command economy couldn't innovate. Oil revenue became the only thing keeping the system alive. When oil prices fell in the 1980s, the Soviet budget imploded. And because the ruble was not a real currency, unconvertible, distrusted, backed only by state decree, the system had no fallback. Once the satellites broke away, the economy collapsed. Once the economy collapsed, the government collapsed. And once the government collapsed, the entire empire dissolved in 900 days. No war, no invasion, just sudden, irreversible implosion. Spain took 80 years. Britain took 40. The USSR took less than 3. Different cultures, different systems, same collapse pattern. Overextension, currency distortion, debt strain, productive decay, social fracture, loss of global monetary trust, collapse every single time. And this is the critical point. America, right now, is showing the exact same structural markers. Military commitments everywhere, explosive debt, rapid debasement, fading industrial capacity, rising social fragmentation, and the first cracks in global reserve currency confidence. The pattern is identical. Every imperial collapse looks different on the surface, but underneath, the mechanics are identical. 5 stages, always in the same order, always feeding into each other, always accelerating faster than anyone inside the system expects. And the United States in 2025 is already deep inside this sequence. You're not watching a pattern begin. You're watching a pattern mature. Let me show you the 5 stages. Stage 1, military overreach. The empire outgrows its body. This is where every superpower begins to lose control, not from weakness, but from excess strength. The empire expands until the cost of maintaining global dominance exceeds the resources that created it. Spain did this first. 4 continents, continuous wars, endless fronts. The Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, rebels in the Netherlands, rival kingdoms in Italy, fleets in the Atlantic, garrisons in the Philippines. By 1580, half of Spain's government revenue went to the military. Even that wasn't enough. Britain followed the same trajectory. At the peak of its empire, the British military had to defend India, Africa, the Middle East, the Pacific, the Caribbean, and Europe. 2 world wars cracked the system open. The Soviet Union did it more brutally than anyone. They spent 15-20% of GDP on the military, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Matching U.S. power required burning their economy alive. Afghanistan was the final cut. 10 years of bleeding for no gain. The mechanism is identical. When your military footprint grows faster than your productive base, collapse becomes a math problem, not a political one. And America today, 800 overseas bases, troops in 150 countries, commitments across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Asia, the Pacific, an $850 billion annual defense budget, more than the next 10 nations combined. Yet equipment is aging, recruitment is falling, readiness is strained, and every alliance demands more, not less. This isn't security. This is overextension. And like Spain, Britain, and the USSR, the bill always comes due. Overreach always leads to the second stage. Stage 2, currency debasement and fiscal distortion. The money breaks before the empire does. When military expansion collides with economic limits, superpowers turn to the same trick. They debase the currency. Spain mixed copper into silver until coins became nearly worthless. The currency collapsed. Inflation exploded. The economy spiraled. Britain tried to maintain the pound at an overvalued gold parity, defending an illusion that drained its reserves and broke its economy. The pound fell 25% the moment they abandoned the gold standard in 1931. Confidence never returned. The USSR didn't have a real currency at all. The ruble worked inside the system only because the government forced it to. Outside the system, it had no value. That fragility was fatal. When oil revenues fell, the entire monetary structure cracked instantly. America entered this stage in 1971. the moment Nixon closed the gold window. For the first time in U.S. history, the dollar became pure fiat, backed by nothing but political decree and global trust. Since then, the money supply has exploded. From 2000 to 2025, the dollar supply rose more than 400%. Since 2020 alone, over $6 trillion was printed into existence. The result is predictable. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1971. The government now runs trillion-dollar deficits even in peacetime, with interest costs approaching $1 trillion per year. This is fiscal distortion at imperial scale, borrowing money to maintain global dominance while debasing the currency that makes that dominance possible. Once a superpower begins inflating away its obligations, the pattern accelerates, because currency distortion feeds directly into the third stage. Stage 3, loss of productive capacity. The engine that built the empire stops running. Superpowers don't collapse when they run out of money. They collapse when they stop creating real wealth. Spain is the perfect example. With endless silver flooding in from the Americas, they stopped producing anything themselves. Manufacturing died. Agriculture stagnated. Nobles considered productive work beneath them. They imported everything, from food to finished goods, and paid for it with silver that eventually ran out. Britain followed the same script. Once the pound became the world's reserve currency, they relied on finance, not industry. Manufacturing competitiveness fell. Germany and America overtook them. After World War II, the British industrial base was so weak they couldn't rebuild without American loans. The empire that once powered the world couldn't power itself. The Soviet Union's collapse was even more extreme. They couldn't innovate, couldn't produce consumer goods, couldn't maintain agricultural output. By the 1980s, the USSR, one of the world's largest land masses, had to import grain. The empire's productive engine had shut down. America is now deep inside this same stage. For 50 years, the U.S. offshored its manufacturing to China, Mexico, Vietnam. Entire industries vanished: electronics, steel, shipbuilding, pharmaceuticals. Today, the U.S. imports over $800 billion more than it exports each year. Even critical military components rely on foreign supply chains. The country that built the factories now buys from the factories it used to own. This is the moment every superpower crosses a point of no return, because when you lose productive capacity, you lose resilience. And once resilience is gone, the fourth stage appears. Stage 4, social decay and institutional unraveling. The internal core collapses before the external shell does. When the economy weakens, the currency debases, and the empire overextends, society fractures. Always. Spain saw mass unemployment, crime, depopulation of cities, and the flight of talent to the Netherlands and France. Britain's post-war decay was slower but unmistakable. Austerity, shortages, strikes, collapsing infrastructure, and the slow psychological shift from global confidence to national doubt. The USSR's decay was the most dramatic. Empty shelves, corruption everywhere, alcoholism, collapsing birth rates, crumbling public services, and a society that no longer believed in its own institutions. And the United States? Every marker is flashing red. Trust in Congress near historic lows. Trust in the Supreme Court collapsing. Trust in elections disintegrating. Homelessness exploding. Crime rising. Drug overdoses at record levels. Civil discourse replaced by political extremism, tribalism, and fragmentation. Fertility rates at record lows, depression and anxiety at record highs. The cultural cohesion that once held the country together is unraveling. And once a superpower enters this stage, the final stage begins. Because the external world senses internal weakness long before the empire itself recognizes it. That's when the cracks in reserve currency confidence begin. Stage 5, reserve currency erosion, the collapse trigger. The last stage of every imperial collapse is financial abandonment. Not war, not invasion, not ideology, abandonment. When Spain debased the real, traders switched to more stable coins. When Britain devalued the pound, global reserves shifted to dollars. When the USSR's economic engine died, the ruble became worthless overnight. The collapse begins the moment the world stops needing the superpower's currency. And that moment has already begun for the United States. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 72% in 2000 to under 58% today. China and Russia now settle trade in yuan and rubles. BRICS nations are building alternatives. Saudi Arabia accepts yuan for oil, breaking a 50-year petrodollar foundation. Central banks worldwide are dumping U.S. treasuries and buying gold at rates not seen since the 1970s. This is how every collapse starts, quietly at first, then suddenly, all at once. As global confidence weakens, dollars held abroad begin to flow back home, flooding the domestic system with surplus supply. Prices spike, imports become unaffordable, debt becomes unpayable, interest costs explode, institutions panic, political leaders lose control. Then the empire falls, not gradually, but in a rapid, violent unwinding of illusions. Spain took 80 years, Britain took 40, the USSR took 3, the United States is on the clock. Now look at America in 2025, not with nostalgia, not with political bias, with the same cold lens we used on Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Because when you strip away the narrative and look only at the numbers, only at the structure, only at the underlying mechanics, it becomes brutally clear. The United States is already deep into stage 4 and drifting towards stage 5 faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. Start with the hard data. U.S. national debt, $37 trillion. Debt to GDP, 122%. Annual deficit, $1.8 trillion even in peacetime. Interest payments nearing $1.2 trillion per year, more than the entire defense budget. Dollar share of global reserves, down to 58%. China has cut U.S. Treasury holdings by over $300 billion since 2021. Central banks worldwide bought over 1,000 tons of gold last year, the highest in modern history. Saudi Arabia, for the first time since the 1970s, accepts yuan for oil. These aren't random data points, they're signals, structural signals. And all of them point to the same conclusion. The U.S. is in stage 4, institutional unraveling, and the early edge of stage 5, reserve currency erosion. Here's the evidence. First, the internal decay matches the exact warning signs Spain, Britain, and the USSR flashed right before collapse. Social cohesion is evaporating. Trust in government is near historic lows. Trust in media has collapsed. Trust in elections is fracturing, with tens of millions believing the system is rigged. Crime is rising. Homelessness is exploding in major cities. Drug overdoses kill over 100,000 Americans per year. Fertility is at record lows. The middle class is being crushed by inflation and housing unaffordability. This is not ideological pessimism, it's structural breakdown. Institutions that once anchored the nation, Congress, courts, law enforcement, public education, are losing legitimacy. Once that legitimacy collapses, the empire's internal core is already broken. And when the internal core weakens, the external world senses it instantly. That's where stage 5 begins. Because reserve currency status is not lost in a dramatic flash. It erodes silently, transaction by transaction, contract by contract, trade agreement by trade agreement, until one day the world stops pretending the dollar is unshakable. That erosion is underway now. In 2000, the dollar dominated global reserves with 72% share. By 2024, it had fallen to under 60%, a drop representing trillions in assets quietly shifting out of U.S. control. China and Russia now trade in yuan and rubles. India settles oil purchases with the UAE in rupees. Brazil and Argentina trade in local currencies. BRICS nations publicly plan a settlement currency designed specifically to bypass the dollar. Even France has reduced dollar exposure. Central banks aren't diversifying. They're hedging against a collapse they see coming. And once enough nations stop needing dollars, the consequences hit home instantly. Because dollar dominance isn't about American productivity. It's about global demand. Lose that demand, and all the dollars printed over the last 50 years come rushing back into the domestic system like a tidal wave. That's when inflation becomes unmanageable. That's when imports become unaffordable. That's when interest costs explode. That's when financial markets destabilize. That's when the government loses the ability to finance its own obligations. That is the moment stage 5 begins in full. And based on the current trajectory, that moment is not decades away, it's years. My timeline prediction, based on historical lag patterns and current data, is this. Stage 5 will accelerate between Q2 2026 and Q4 2027. The trigger will not be a dramatic event. It will be a structural shift. Saudi Arabia formalizing multi-currency oil settlements, China launching a full yuan oil benchmark, BRICS finalizing a commodity-backed settlement asset, or a major geopolitical shock that forces foreign holders to dump U.S. treasuries. Any one of these is enough. The more likely scenario is a combination, a slow erosion that suddenly becomes a stampede. The collapse of reserve currency confidence always begins gradually, then breaks violently once a tipping point is reached. And here's the part most Americans don't see. The tipping point has already formed. You see it in treasury auctions, showing weaker foreign demand. You see it in rising gold purchases. You see it in declining global trust. You see it in America's inability to stabilize its own political system. Time isn't the issue anymore. Trajectory is. And the trajectory matches the final stage of every empire that came before it. The pattern destroyed Spain. It destroyed Britain. It destroyed the Soviet Union. And now, for the first time in modern history, the world's last superpower is showing the same structural fractures, the same financial signals, the same internal unraveling. If this breakdown helped you see the sequence clearly, if it showed you where America actually stands inside this historic pattern, then hit subscribe, because over the next months, I'm tracking every indicator that matters. Reserve currency shifts, debt pressure, foreign dumping of treasuries, gold accumulation, and the political fractures that tell you where the timeline is heading. When these signals move, they move fast, and you won't hear about them on the news until it's already too late. And if you want deeper breakdowns, the kind that goes beyond headlines and into the real mechanics, join the premium tier. You'll get early access charts, full-length collapse models, monthly macro briefings, and step-by-step frameworks for protecting your buying power in a system that's losing stability. Not fear, not hype, just the math. Because when an empire enters stage 5, the clock doesn't slow down, it speeds up. And once global confidence breaks, it never returns. The pattern never lies. The clock is running.